Good afternoon, grade 7s. This will be our last lesson, hopefully, that I have to do remotely. We will be all going well back at school on Monday. So we're going to continue with history. I see our history test is in 2 weeks' time, so I thought I'd like to finish with some history first. And today we're going to be talking about a few things, most notably the legacy of slavery, and also we're going to look at the Dutch Huguenots and the French Huguenots. Okay, so let's start with this whole idea of a legacy. So what is a legacy? A legacy is something that we leave behind. So we often talk about the legacy of famous people. We talk about the legacy of Madiba, ex-president Nelson Mandela, and what he did to unify our country. But we can also talk about the legacy of a group of people. It could even be a sports team, the famous Man United teams of the past. We talk about what legacy they left for future football players. But when we talk about legacy, we also talk about the legacy of slavery. So slavery was an horrific thing. It's nothing that we should be proud of in our past. However, I think we can be very proud of some of the things that came from the slaves who came over from all over the world, but most notably from the Dutch East Indies and Madagascar being the two most popular destinations that they came from. So when we look at it, these are three photos that I have here, and they're all examples of the slave legacy. Okay, I'll give you a sec. Let me just undo that. I've got it on the wrong settings, excuse me. Okay, so I'm sure we've all eaten that. Say it out loud. It is bobotie. It's a very South African dish. It's probably the most famous South African dish. And it'll come as no surprise to you that the origin of bobotie was from the Dutch East Indies, from Southeast Asia. That's where it came from. It's been adapted and changed in South Africa. And then this style of architecture, which the Cape is very famous for. I'm sure you've seen it before. It's called Cape Dutch architecture, with the high gables, very often with thatch roofs. Really stupid when the fynbos burn so often. These thatch roofs tend to go up in flames, but very, very beautiful style of architecture. And it's called Cape Dutch architecture, but actually it was the slaves, the skilled slaves, many of them from the Southeast Asia that came over that built that. And we even see legacy in dress. I'll be very impressed if any of you know what a shirt like this is often called. It's called a Madiba shirt because it was made famous by ex-president Nelson Mandela. He used to wear shirts like this. And this sort of pattern is synonymous with what slaves brought over and were wearing, rather than that very stiff closed shirt and tie, which is more suited to the cold weather of Europe than it is to South Africa. But perhaps the two most important areas of legacy that the slaves left, remember legacy is what was left behind, was Islam and Afrikaans. So let's just take it step by step. Perhaps one of the most famous persons to come over way back, just 30 or 40 years after we became a colony, a fellow by the name of Sheikh Yusuf. And he was originally from Macassar in the East Indies. He was involved in a war against the Dutch. The Dutch didn't want to kill him and make him a martyr, so they sent him to the Cape. And he used his time in the Cape to teach many slaves about Islam. He converted many slaves to Islam. He was also responsible for the first mosque being built in South Africa. That's a picture of it there. And he also established madrasa, which are Muslim schools. And to give you an idea of how successful he was and how much Islam was adopted, by 1840, a third of the entire population of the Cape was Muslim, and there is still, as you know, a very strong Muslim tradition at the Cape still today. And Afrikaans is an interesting one because we tend to think of Afrikaans as being a language that derives almost exclusively from Dutch. It was the Dutch trekboers and the Dutch farmers who came over here, changed the language over centuries, and Afrikaans is their language. That's not entirely true. Certainly, there's a lot of Dutch in Afrikaans, and there's a lot of influence of the Dutch language and the Dutch farmers or trekboers in Afrikaans. But it was actually first a slave language. So slaves were actually forced to learn Dutch so they could communicate with their masters. But the slaves then added many words to the Dutch language, and slowly Afrikaans developed. So both the Dutch themselves started to change the language, and the slaves did as well. In fact, the very first book that we know of that was written in Afrikaans and called Afrikaans was not only written by a Muslim, it was in Arabic script. So no A, B, C's, as you can see there. Arabic script is just a different way of writing letters. So Afrikaans has a strong slave legacy, and so does Islam. Okay, so no, we're not handing out free burgers. This is not a McDonald's special, but we're going to look at free burgers, Dutch and French Huguenots, and why they immigrated to the Cape. Okay, so we know that the settlement at the Cape was unable to grow enough food to feed the people and to supply the ships. And even when slaves were brought over, they didn't have enough space and time. So Jan van Riebeeck was the first to give 9 free burgers. They were called, a burger is a Dutch word for citizen, and they granted farming land along the Liesbeek River. Those of you who know Cape Town, that's sort of in the Rondebosch area today. They granted free farms along the Liesbeek River, and those 9 became the first free citizens of the Cape. They were the first Dutch settlers who did not work for the DEIC, the Dutch East India Company. And from those 9, more and more were granted freehold land. And all they had to do, they had to agree to sell their produce, whatever they farmed, to the refreshment station at the Cape. When the Khoi saw Dutch farmers beginning to settle on the land, they became worried about losing their grazing lands. Up until this point, the Dutch were only concentrated around Table Bay and didn't pose a huge threat. But now suddenly the Khoi understandably felt under threat. The Dutch farmers were fencing in land. They were preventing the Khoi from going into their traditional nomadic hunting grounds, etc. So as the number of free burger farmers increased, the Khoi lost their herds, and more Khoi grazing was taken over for farms. Obviously, the Dutch had more advanced weapons, and when the Khoi did attack them, and it happened quite often, then they were simply slaughtered. They did their best, though. They poisoned the water holes, that's the Khoi. They fought a number of small battles, and in fact 2 wars, but eventually, not having the weapons, the Khoi lost because the Dutch had guns and also horses, which makes you more mobile during war. So the Khoi were forced to give up much of their grazing land to the Dutch. Without their grazing land, they lost their livestock, and many of them were forced to work for the free burghers alongside the slaves. Now, I must make this point, they never became slaves. They were paid workers, but of course they were paid very badly and they were treated very badly. It was very hard for them. They wanted to keep on with their traditional nomadic lifestyle, but they couldn't. And many of them decided they wanted to leave, and they joined the San up in the desert areas of South Africa. And then we started to refer to them as Khoisan, because effectively the Khoi and San amalgamated or became one. Okay, this is a slave or Khoi servant transporting wine to Cape Town. So this is a few decades after Jan van Riebeeck arrived. But at this time, the Khoi had lost much of their culture and their identity, and had become workers or servants of the Dutch. As the settlers took over more and more of the Khoi land and livestock, the Khoi became servants of the Dutch. Sorry, we've done that already. The picture, the worker in the foreground, that's this guy here, is Khoi, and the other workers are slaves. You can see that's not anything sinister. They were very, very hooked on tobacco. So that's him smoking a pipe. And he would have been a paid Khoi laborer, and there in the background, doing most of the heavy work, what were the slaves. Okay, so this is what I want you to do, activity 3.9. It doesn't say 3.29, it just says activity 9 in your books. It's the same thing. But again, we're just going to look at a primary source here from Jan van Riebeck's journal, which we use quite a lot to understand what was happening at the Cape. 20th of February, 1857, the Khoikhoi asked where they were to go should we build houses there and cultivate the land. We answered that they might live under our protection, and that there was enough room for grazing their animals. We would use the land in order to make bread and tobacco, of which we, as good friends, give them a share. It was clear it was not entirely to their liking. No kidding, right? But obviously that was an attempt by the Dutch to almost bribe them, particularly with tobacco, which the Dutch had brought over and the Khoi had got addicted to. Okay, so when I'm finished with this video, you must do these 5 questions here. As I say, it's activity 9 in your book. Why did Jan van Riebeck allow people to become free burgers? Why can the establishment of free burger farmers be seen as the beginning of a colony? You'll have to think. You won't find that answer in your books. How did the Khoikhoi feel about the new burger farmers? When the Dutch said to the Khoikhoi, there is enough room for grazing their animals, did this turn out to be true? And you must justify your answer. You can't just say yes or no. How did the free burger farms affect the Khoikhoi way of life? So just as a rough idea, 2 or 3 marks for each of those, just so that you know how much you need to write. Okay, so now we're going to come on to other immigrants, other people who came to South Africa. So obviously the Dutch desperately wanted to increase the number of Dutch citizens, that they could have more farmers, obviously they could take over more land, and then they'd be able to supply more produce to the passing ships. So when the people in the Netherlands heard that people were being given farms at the Cape, yes, they were given them, they didn't have to pay for them, some decided to immigrate to the Cape so that they could own their own land. Land was very expensive in Holland. Holland is a very small country with a big population, and so many came over. But perhaps the biggest lot were in fact French immigrants. So the first thing I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. I know you studied it, I think, in either grade 5 or 6, the Protestant Reformation. But at this stage in Europe, we had 2 major religions. Catholic religion, which was the most dominant, and starting now was the Protestant religions. And basically what happened, if you were Protestant, you were persecuted in France. So the Catholic king did not allow Protestants, and they were persecuted. They were imprisoned. They were even burnt at the stake. They weren't allowed to, there was no religious freedom. They weren't allowed to have their own churches. So in 1688, about 200 French-speaking immigrants arrived at the Cape, and they were called Huguenots. So there's 2 lots, the Dutch Huguenots, but the far more famous was the French Huguenots. So this gives you some idea. In 1687, 800 Dutch Huguenots came out, and 1688, 200 French Huguenots came out. The Dutch are often not referred to as Huguenots. So when we talk about Huguenots, we're talking about the French Huguenots. And I think you know, because a lot of you go there on the weekends, nice place to eat. They, of course, settled mainly in the Franschhoek area, but they were given land near the Berg River. So there were many Huguenots in Wellington too, hence the name of one of our neighboring schools, Huguenot. All right, so the important thing is that these Huguenots were skilled workers. Many of them were wagon makers, they were farmers, many of them were wine farmers, hence the very strong influence we still have with France in our wines. Just think of the names of the wine farms in Franschhoek. And they became very successful farmers and businessmen in the Cape. And that is why still today Franschhoek is considered to be a French town with very, very strong French influence. They celebrate Bastille Day. Many of the farms have French names. Many of the streets have French names. And this is because of the French Huguenots who came over. A lot of you would have seen this. This is the Huguenot monument. If you drive down the main road of Franschhoek rather, you'll see this right at the end. Some of you might have visited it. And Okay, so let's just take pause and go back a sec. By now, Jan van Riebeeck had left. The next person was the next VOC governor after Jan van Riebeeck was Shimon van der Stel. And unlike Jan van Riebeeck just wanted to supply meat and produce to the passing ships. Simon van der Stel wanted to extend the colony much further in order to have more produce. And so when he was VOC government at the time, he allowed the French Huguenots to come, but he was scared that they would remain French, that they would not settle into a Dutch colony. So he introduced 3 laws, and you need to know these 3 laws. He made the Huguenots take an oath of allegiance to the ruler of the Netherlands. At that stage, his name was Prince William of Orange. I think that's why the Dutch always wear orange when they play sport, particularly soccer. He encouraged the Huguenots to join the Dutch Reformed Church. The Dutch Reformed Church was also a Protestant church, so some of them were prepared to do that. It wasn't a Catholic church. And he also encouraged the Huguenots to learn the Dutch language. He was sort of successful, but not really. Many of the French were very proud of their heritage and their language and their church, and many of them continued with that. But over time, the Huguenots became amalgamated into the new culture at the Cape, and that's why in Afrikaans we have many French words, and that would be because of the French Huguenots. Right, the last thing that you need to do is activity 10, which is on page 173, or this is obviously all loaded for you on Classroom. Look at source N. After the Huguenots arrived, what proportion of the free population did they form? And why do you think Van der Stel made the rules listed in source O above for the Huguenots? So why? Not what were the rules? Why do you think he made it? I think there are some hints there in the text. Right, good luck. Please submit either a doc or a photo of your work today, and that's activity 9 and 10.